Hello and welcome to another in the series of videos by the Quaker Council for European Affairs. Today we're talking about the climate and ecological emergency with the author, philosophy professor and XR campaigner Rupert Read. My name is Andrew Lane. I'm here at the Quaker House in Brussels, and also on the call is Mieke van Opheusden, who's in the Netherlands. Hi Mieke.
So thank you, Rupert, for being here with us. Just to start off, you have spoken and written extensively on the subject of the climate and ecological crisis. And just to get us started, can you kind of paint a picture for us in terms of what's really the scale of the problem and what's at stake?
Yeah, so I think that the first thing to say here is that a lot of people are thinking, oh, well, this is getting really urgent and it's getting closer and closer to midnight. It's getting closer and closer to 0 hour. But that's the wrong way to think about the situation. It's already gone midnight. It's already past 0 hour. If we were going to be intelligent and wise about this, if we were going to apply the precautionary principle, which would mean that we wouldn't be doing all sorts of reckless things that we have been doing, if we were going to really take care of ourselves and our children, we would have acted about 2 generations ago. And we would have put in an enormous program for a green transition in roughly the 1980s. So we're way past midnight. And what that means is this is now as much about damage limitation and triage and adaptation as it is about mitigation and prevention. Now, that's not necessarily a message that people really want to hear, but just for that reason, it's the most important message to actually deliver and to open oneself to. And I've made that a key part of what I've been trying to do in the last few years. And it's been central to the message of Extinction Rebellion, which has said, look, the situation is absolutely desperate. Other species are going extinct at an unprecedented rate. We ourselves might be at risk of extinction, and we're certainly at major risk now of civilizational collapse. So that's my kind of overarching perspective on the situation that we are in. It's not true to say that the situation is urgent and we have to act fast. What is true to say is that the situation is beyond urgent. We should have acted ages ago. And that means that the situation is one where we have to confront very hard and unpalatable truths. If you're not terrified, you're not paying attention. If you don't sometimes feel despair, then you're probably suppressing your feelings, or otherwise you're just in ignorance of how bad the situation is. And that's the kind of background for going into what we need to be talking about in terms of the kinds of changes we need to make and the kinds of measures that we need to take. The post-COVID-19 reset could, I think, legitimately be viewed as kind of a last chance for humanity. But because these kinds of opportunities for reset don't come along every year, they don't even come along every decade. The last one was probably in 2008 with a financial crisis. But we have to ask the question, what is this opportunity for reset an opportunity for? And my claim is, unfortunately, it is not an opportunity for a kind of calm, smooth green transition. If we were going to take that opportunity, we needed to take it about 35 years ago. It is an opportunity to stop ourselves possibly from collapsing our entire civilization and to making the deterioration, which is bound to happen in our climate and ecology over the next generation, less bad.
Thank you, Rupert. We're all living in a particular moment, as you've already alluded to. We have to think about the concept of caution in our own lives every day, whether we decide to wear a mask or visit our family. And then also at a European policy level, different countries have decided what level of caution they want to take with regard to the pandemic. So countries like Finland and Slovakia have taken a more cautious approach. and the UK and Sweden have opted for a more cavalier option. You've written widely about the precautionary principle, which you've already mentioned. Can you just explain to us what it is and why it's relevant?
Yeah. So the precautionary principle basically starts with the idea that we should not do harm. First, do no harm. Assess what you're going to do carefully. Look before you leap. The precautionary principle doesn't say don't cross the road because you might get knocked over. That's a silly kind of misrepresentation. But the precautionary principle implies don't cross the road blindfolded, or don't cross the road dragging your family along behind them if it's a dangerous, busy road. If you really want to take a risk and cross a dangerous, busy road, cross it with open eyes, looking left and right, and take responsibility for your own actions. Don't make other people suffer for any risks that you're going to take. So as you've suggested, the precautionary principle has been applied by some countries in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic. And notable among those countries are perhaps Austria and Slovakia in Europe, and even more strikingly, countries such as Taiwan and New Zealand. And those countries have come out of this crisis very well. The precautionary principle has not been applied in countries such as the UK, the USA, and Brazil. And those countries are doing disastrously badly in relation to the pandemic. This is a kind of microcosm of the situation in relation to the climate and ecological emergency, where the timetables are much longer, and where that means you have to act with much more foresight, much further ahead of the clock. And that's why I say that tragically, we've already missed the boat to a considerable extent on the climate and ecological emergency. We missed it 35, 40 years ago. But of course, better late than never. It's never too late to apply the precautionary principle. It's never too late to stop being reckless. What would that mean now? Well, for example, it would mean that we would no longer prioritize so-called economic growth. I say so-called economic growth because the growth that we are now experiencing is basically in the financial sector, and it is not, I would argue, economic. The growth that we are now experiencing is uneconomic growth. The damage caused by the growth that goes on now, when it does go on, is more than the benefits you get from that growth. The damage in particular to ecosystems, but also to society's fabric itself. So the precautious thing to do, the wise thing to do, the unreckless thing to do now would be no longer to prioritize economic growth, and instead, so-called, and instead to prioritize well-being and safety, as intelligent countries have done during the COVID-19 crisis. And it is very interesting to see now opinion polls around the world with people saying in those polls, it is more important to save lives than to open up the economy. It is more important that we care for our fellow citizens and for our family members than that we try to pursue GDP growth. Public opinion has changed on this, and governments and leaders and bureaucrats need to wake up to that. So what would we do now if we were to really follow the precautionary principle? Well, we would act to ensure that future pandemics do not take place, for example. And that would mean we would stop habitat destruction, we would stop the maltreatment of animals, and we would move to rein in dangerous climate change. And that itself is something which we obviously need to do if we are to be precautious, if we are to look after our children. So there's an obvious reprioritization that needs to happen now. Some people object to the precautionary principle and they say, yes, but we want to be innovative. We don't want to have a situation of stasis. Actually, the precautionary principle is the best way to ensure that your economy and your society are innovative. Companies which have products that they profit from, which cause social and ecological risk, they don't want to change. They want to carry on producing those products, whether those products be dangerous chemicals or fossil fuels or indeed cigarettes. The precautionary principle forces companies and countries to innovate, to find safer ways of doing business, to find safer ways of running our societies and of organizing our future.
Thank you. Yeah, you've already just referred to the economic system or the economy, and something that has struck me as very strange over the past 3 months is that the economic crisis as a result of the pandemic seems to be almost bigger than the health crisis itself, or at least it is depicted as such, and it's pushing a lot of people into poverty, which is a kind of a strange thing, because really the main thing that caused it is the fact that we're suddenly forced to consume less. And if you look at that from a climate perspective, that's exactly one of the things we will be needing to do if we want to prevent further damage. So how can we redesign an economy in such a way that it can actually handle that situation? And how can we use the situation that we're in now as an opportunity to get closer to that?
Yeah, well, that's exactly the point. This economic crisis is also an opportunity. It's an opportunity for transformation. It's an opportunity we simply must take, because, as I say, these opportunities don't come along very often. It's an opportunity to shift to a different kind of economy and society, one that prioritizes well-being, that prioritizes care, that no longer pursues growth as an objective, a meaningless, abstract objective, frankly, a harmful objective at this point in time. We ought instead to deliberately pursue a transition to a post-growth or degrowth future, which puts human needs and the needs of our planet at the heart of everything, rather than ripping up regulations for the sake of temporary, short-term corporate well-being. Now, I say it's an opportunity because, of course, there are enormous opportunities for people to have worthwhile jobs in this transition. There are vast numbers of jobs needing to be done in green sectors, in the sectors of the future. And this is, of course, why people are talking now about a Green New Deal or a Green Industrial Revolution. This has to be done very carefully. It has to be done right. If it is done as a way of simply trying to return to old-fashioned economic growth, then it won't be genuinely green and it won't achieve its objectives. What we need to do is replace the aging, decaying, dying, failed industries of the past with newer green industries. So rather than simply trying to grow the whole economy, we ought to be replacing fossil fuels with renewable energy and leaving those fossil fuels in the ground. So if you're looking at companies like Shell or BP, for example, those companies, if they wish to survive, should stop being companies which are basically fossil companies. And it's not enough for them to transition even to being renewable energy companies. They need to become energy service companies. And what that means is they need to become companies which are about trying to ensure that we have the services that energy gives us, because that's what we actually want. People don't need energy. What they need is the services that energy delivers. And that is things like having warmth. And there are many ways that you can have warmth in the winter. You don't need to burn coal. You don't even need to burn an electric heater or something like that. You can have well-designed houses, passive houses they're called technically, which don't require any energy. You can have windows that let heat in and don't let heat out in the winter. You can do even more simple things, such as wearing an extra pullover or jersey. And you might laugh at that. Somebody might think, well, what's that got to do with a company like Shell or BP? If more people wore pullovers or jerseys in the winter, then we would need to burn less energy. And that is part of how the future will be. And that's part of what governments should be doing and what part of responsible corporations should be doing. So that's just an example, but it's quite an important example. There is an enormous transition coming. There is a huge transformation coming. The only question is whether companies and corporations and citizens are going to get on board with it proactively or not. Because if we don't get on board with it proactively, then it is going to wash over us as a crisis, indeed as a collapse. The future is going to be a future with a lot less energy being burned. That will occur either because we choose voluntarily to co-create such a future, or because our society collapses. And in a collapsed society, believe you me, there'll be a lot less energy delivered and used. So that is the stark choice facing us, that people don't necessarily want to face up to, but more and more people are realizing that we have no choice but to face up to it. That's one of the reasons for the enormous growth of movements such as Extinction Rebellion and the climate school strikes. And the voice of Greta Thunberg and her colleagues, that is the voice of the future. That is the voice that must be listened to. Those corporates and those so-called leaders who do not listen to and seriously act on that voice, they will be judged.
I'm also interested in the role of spirituality in this, related to this issue, because it is an important element, for example, in terms of you know, it can provide a moral compass when it comes to redefining our values, or it can be something that can encourage people to keep faith, literally, when the situation seems quite dire. But I think there's something else as well that has to do with how we relate to the earth, and how we define ourselves as a human species, and that we have to say, like, well, we're not separate from nature that we can dominate over, but we are part of nature, and we're part of a web of life, and we're actually dependent on that web of life. And when you look at it from that perspective, our identity, our feeling of identity, actually becomes different. And to me, that in itself is kind of a spiritual process.
Yes.
So what are your reflections on that, and what would help us embark on that spiritual journey?
Well, I couldn't agree more. I'm a Quaker, a member of the Religious Society of Friends. And for me, this kind of possibility of calmly communing with other people and with nature is really part of what makes life worth living. And you ask, what could help us to embark on this kind of deeper understanding? Well, I think we've already been enabled to embark on it. I think that in the lockdowns that nearly all of us have experienced, there's been a renewed appreciation of that kind of calmness and a renewed appreciation of nature. And that has come because very, very many of us have noticed how much more pleasant life is when you don't have airplanes going overhead constantly, when you don't have a constant drone of car noise in the background and air pollution. And many of us have literally noticed the sound of the birds singing, a sound that was maybe drowned out often in our lives by those planes or those cars, etc. And many of us have also noticed that for the period perhaps that we experienced when we weren't able to get as much access to nature or wild places as we would have wished, that we really missed it. And that nature and greenness and wildlife and so on, that these aren't just sort of optional added bonuses. These are absolutely central to our lives and our meanings and to who we are. And if we don't get enough of them, it can literally make us ill. And of course, that's been proven in recent years with various kinds of fascinating scientific and psychological experiments, that a lack of nature actually makes us ill. So I think that there is enormous power, including what you call, Mieke, a kind of spiritual power that is accessible to all of us in these experiences that we've had during lockdown. And now most countries are releasing some of this lockdown. But what we must insist is that there is no going back to the situation that there was before, that we don't go back to a situation where we were making our climate worse and destroying ecosystems, that we don't go back to a situation where we were probabilifying pandemics, and that we don't go back to a situation where the beautiful sounds of nature and the experience of communing with it were drowned out by car noise and plane noise. We have to be serious about this. Now is the time when we have to make sure that there is no going back. And this is a huge responsibility on every one of us, and a huge responsibility on our leaders. It means many things, but among the things it means are, we must ensure that there is more space for pedestrians, more space for cyclists, more serious attention given to how we can protect and rebuild and restore nature. Because in a country like Britain or a continent like Europe, nature is so depleted. We ought to be restoring nature here, and only if we do so can we be taken seriously when we call on other countries which have more of their nature intact to defend the nature that they still have. And if we do those things, the future can be more beautiful. And if we don't do those things, well, there won't be much of a future. So it's a crucial moment of inflection. We have to really mean it. No going back to how life was before this coronavirus crisis.
Rupert, thank you so much. Really, really interesting. The last question from me, the three of us here, we're in Britain, Belgium, and the Netherlands. You know, we're all in countries whose wealth in the last few hundred years has derived, you know, from specific processes of colonialism, slavery, human trafficking, but also from industrialization and habitat destruction. You know, what should that mean for us now in terms of, as you know, majority white climate movement in Europe? How should we be reflecting on that history as we move forward?
Well, I think that's a great question to finish with, because it's so pertinent to this moment, isn't it? When there's been this impressive upsurge of Black Lives Matter protests. And for me, the essence of what's really important going forward from this new moment that we're in right now is exactly what you said. It's exactly the confluence of racism, economic exploitation, exploitation of nature, of the way all of these things have kind of been part of one bigger picture, and the way we absolutely must turn the page to a better picture. Otherwise, as I've said, and I mean this quite literally, our civilization will not be here in a generation or two's time. It will have gone, it will have been erased like so many civilizations before it over the course of human history. And in particular, if we think about the legacy of colonialism, we must think about that as a legacy of racial exploitation, economic exploitation, and exploitation of nature and of our environment. And it's crucial for us to be clear that if you solve only one of these problems and leave the others intact, then you haven't really made very much progress. What we have to do, going back to something that Mieke said a minute ago, is ensure that there is more humility from us as human beings in this situation as we go forward. Because it seems to me that really at the root of so much of the disaster, of the collateral damage that our civilization has caused over the last few centuries, is some kind of notion of human exceptionalism, of human beings as being somehow separate from nature and separate from the world. And it's just not true. And while we extend the way in which we take seriously that we are one human family, and that we rise or fall together, we also have to extend seriously the notion that we're part of something which is much larger than humanity. And if we respect other human beings but don't respect the environment, then that's a very, very short-term gain. It will not last. So my desperate and deep hope is that we can use this moment to effect a real transformation in the way that we regard other species and in the way that we regard the beautiful natural world that surrounds us, the only one that we've got. As I say, this probably is our last chance to get this right. It's not a chance, unfortunately, for everything to be okay. It's too late for that. But it is a chance for us to stop the worst of what is otherwise coming, and to preserve and indeed to restore the beauty of so much of what is around us even today. And to end on, I think, a hopeful note, the way that the COVID crisis has woken us up, I think, once again, to the value and the beauty of nature means that perhaps we're in a better place than we have been in before to restore nature, to restore biodiverse wild ecosystems. And in those, if anything, will lie very much of our salvation.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Some important messages. No time for a gentle transition, but time for urgent and socially responsible degrowth. So thank you very much, Rupert Read in Britain, and Mieke in the Netherlands. Thank you very much to you too, and thanks for watching wherever you are in Europe or beyond. Great to have you with us. Thank you.
Thank you.